Blood was spilled on the hardwood floor of the saloon as Beau Preston's fist connected with the jaw of a drunken cattle rustler, sending him sprawling backward into a table of card players. The year was 1877, and in the small town of Kingston, Wyoming territory, justice often came at the end of a man's knuckles before it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. "Get him out of here," Beau growled, flexing his bruised hand as two men dragged the unconscious rustler toward the swinging doors. "And tell him if he comes back claiming I cheated him again, I'll put a bullet in him instead of just my fist." The owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a portly man named Herbert Thompson, handed Beau a whiskey. "That's the third fight this week, Preston. You're scaring away my customers." Beau downed the amber liquid in one swallow, savoring the burn as it traveled down his throat. At 32 years old, he'd earned his reputation as one of the most feared gunslingers in the territory, though these days he mostly kept to himself on his small ranch outside of town. "Put it on my tab," Beau said, tossing his hat back on his head. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the distant mountains as he stepped out onto the dusty main street of Kingston. The town had grown considerably in the decade since Beau had first arrived, a half-starved 18-year-old with nothing but a horse, a revolver, and nightmares from a war that had ended too late to save his family's farm in Missouri. Now, Kingston boasted a general store, a telegraph office, 3 saloons, a hotel, and most recently, a white-steepled church that stood at the far end of town like an accusing finger pointed at heaven. Beau had never set foot inside it. His relationship with God, if there was one, had ended on a battlefield in Tennessee, watching young men no older than himself die crying for their mothers. Whatever faith he'd carried from childhood had bled out on that field alongside them. He mounted his dappled gray stallion, Thunder, and set off toward his ranch 6 miles outside of town. The fading daylight painted the rolling hills and distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. It was a sight that still gave him pause, even after all these years. Beauty in a hard land. That's what had kept him in Wyoming when so many others had moved on. His ranch was modest, a small but sturdy cabin, a barn, a corral for his horses, and enough grazing land to support the small herd of cattle he'd built up over the years. It wasn't much compared to some of the sprawling operations in the territory, but it was his, bought and paid for with years of backbreaking work, occasional bounties, and poker winnings. As Thunder's hooves carried him up the path to his cabin, Beau noticed something unusual on his porch, a small leather-bound book. He dismounted cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his Colt revolver. Years of survival had taught him that unexpected things were rarely good things. After securing Thunder to the hitching post, Beau approached the porch, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of visitors. Finding none, he picked up the book. It was small enough to fit in his palm, bound in worn brown leather with no title on the cover. When he opened it, he discovered it was a hymnal, the kind used in church services. A small piece of paper had been tucked between the pages, marking a specific hymn. In neat feminine handwriting, a note read, "This brought me comfort in my darkest hours. Perhaps it will do the same for you. E.T." Beau stared at the initials, trying to place them. E.T.? He knew most people in Kingston and the surrounding area, but he couldn't recall anyone with those initials. The hymn the note marked was titled "Amazing Grace." He scoffed, closing the book and nearly tossing it aside. But something curiosity, perhaps, or just the strange intimacy of receiving such a personal gift made him slip it into his coat pocket instead. Inside his cabin, he lit a lamp and prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. As he ate, the hymnal seemed to burn in his pocket like a hot coal. Finally, he pulled it out and opened it again to the marked page. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," he read aloud, his voice sounding strange in the quiet cabin. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The words stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Memories of his mother singing hymns while she worked in their small Missouri farmhouse. His father, stern but fair, reading from the Bible by lamplight, a life that had been ripped away from him by war and death and years of hard living. "Nonsense," he muttered, closing the book again. But instead of returning it to his pocket, he placed it on the small shelf beside his bed, where it sat like an unwelcome visitor. The next morning, Beau rode into town for supplies, the mystery of the hymnal and its sender nagging at him like a splinter under his skin. At the general store, he collected his usual items: coffee, flour, bacon, bullets, while casually inquiring about any newcomers to town. "Matter of fact, there is," said Milton Greaves, the storekeeper. "New schoolteacher arrived last week. Town council hired her from back east somewhere. Miss Elizabeth Taylor, I believe. Real proper lady. She's staying at the boarding house until the schoolhouse living quarters are finished." Elizabeth Taylor. E.T. Beau felt a jolt of recognition. "What's she look like?" Milton stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Young, I'd say 25 or so. Pretty in a quiet sort of way. Brown hair, blue eyes. Been attending church regular with Mrs. Halloran. Why do you ask?" Beau shrugged noncommittally. "Just curious about new folks?" After leaving the store, Beau found himself riding toward the small schoolhouse at the edge of town rather than heading home. It was Saturday, but he thought the new teacher might be there preparing for the coming week. The schoolhouse was a single-room building with freshly painted white siding and a small bell tower. Through the window, Beau could see a slender woman with her back to him, arranging books on shelves. He dismounted, removed his hat, and smoothed back his dark hair before knocking on the door. When it opened, he found himself looking into the bluest eyes he'd ever seen. "May I help you?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. Beau cleared his throat. "Miss Taylor, I'm Beau Preston. I believe you left something on my porch yesterday." Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been embarrassment. "Mr. Preston." "Yes, I did. I hope you didn't find it presumptuous." "Found it curious, mostly," he said, studying her. Milton's description hadn't done her justice. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just pretty in a quiet sort of way. She was striking, with delicate features, full lips, and those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. "Would you like to come in?" she offered, stepping aside. "I've just made some tea." Beau hesitated, then nodded, ducking his head slightly to enter the schoolhouse. The interior smelled of fresh paint, chalk, and something floral that he guessed was her perfume. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to one of the student desks. Beau looked at the small desk doubtfully, then perched awkwardly on its edge, his knees nearly touching his chest. Elizabeth smiled at the sight, a brief, warm expression that transformed her face before turning to pour tea into 2 cups. "I assume you're wondering why a stranger would leave a hymnal on your porch," she said, handing him a cup of tea. "The thought had crossed my mind," Beau replied dryly, accepting the cup even though he preferred coffee. Elizabeth took a seat at her desk, smoothing her simple blue dress. "When I arrived in Kingston, Mrs. Halloran was kind enough to tell me about the town and its people." She hesitated. "She mentioned you." "Did she now?" Beau's voice hardened slightly. Widow Halloran was known as the town's most dedicated gossip. "She said you were a good man who'd seen too much hardship, that you keep to yourself and never attend church." Elizabeth's gaze was direct but not judgmental. "I recognized something in her description of you, Mr. Preston. Something familiar." "And what's that?" "Pain," she said simply. "The kind that makes a person stop believing in goodness." Beau set down his teacup with a clatter. "Miss Taylor, I appreciate the sentiment, but my spiritual welfare isn't your concern. I've made my peace with God, or rather, the lack of him." Instead of being offended, Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "I felt the same way once. After my parents and brother died of typhoid fever 3 years ago, I was angry at God for taking them, for leaving me alone." The raw honesty in her voice caught Beau off guard. "What changed?" Nothing changed overnight, she admitted. But that hymn, the one I marked it, helped me remember that grace isn't something we earn or deserve. It just is. Like rain falling on parched earth. Beau stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Well, I appreciate your concern, Miss Taylor, but I'm afraid I'm beyond salvation. He placed his hat back on his head. I'll leave you to your preparations. Mr. Preston, she called as he reached the door. I didn't mean to offend you, and I won't push this on you again, but you're welcome to keep the hymnal. Beau paused, then nodded curtly before stepping out into the sunlight, strangely unsettled by the encounter. Over the next few weeks, Beau found himself thinking about Elizabeth Taylor more often than he cared to admit. The hymnal remained on his shelf, untouched but not forgotten. Occasionally he would catch glimpses of her in town, teaching children in the schoolyard, shopping at the general store, or walking with Mrs. Halloran on Sundays, dressed in her finest for church. He made a point of avoiding direct contact, tipping his hat politely when their paths crossed but never stopping to talk. Yet he found himself riding into town more frequently than usual, often finding excuses to pass by the schoolhouse around the time classes ended. Spring was turning to summer, bringing with it longer days and occasional thunderstorms that transformed the landscape into a riot of wildflowers and green grass. During one such storm, Beau was caught in town, taking shelter under the awning of the gunsmith's shop when he spotted Elizabeth struggling against the wind and rain, a stack of books clutched to her chest. Without thinking, he dashed across the muddy street, shrugging off his duster as he went. "Miss Taylor!" he called over the howling wind. "Here, take this." He draped the coat over her shoulders, noticing how her dress was already soaked through, clinging to her slender frame. "Mr. Preston," she gasped, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. "Thank you, but what about you?" "I've weathered worse," he said, taking the books from her arms. "Where are you headed?" "The boarding house," she replied, clutching his coat around her. Beau nodded toward the nearby hotel. "That's too far in this storm. Let's get you somewhere dry first." They hurried to the Kingston Hotel, where the lobby offered warm shelter from the deluge. Beau was acutely aware of the curious looks they received the notorious gunslinger and the prim schoolteacher, both dripping water onto the polished floor. "I appreciate your gallantry, Mr. Preston," Elizabeth said, attempting to wring water from her skirts discreetly. "It wasn't gallantry," he replied, running a hand through his wet hair. "Just common decency." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Which is a form of gallantry these days, wouldn't you say?" Despite himself, Beau smiled back. "Perhaps." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Elizabeth spoke again. "I've been meaning to ask if you've read any of the hymnal." Beau shifted uncomfortably. "Can't say that I have, Miss Taylor. Been busy with the ranch," she nodded, not pressing the issue. "Of course, I understand." After a slight hesitation, she added, "The children have been learning about local history. I wonder, would you consider coming to speak to them sometime? Many of them have heard stories about you." "Stories?" Beau raised an eyebrow. "What kind of stories?" Elizabeth blushed slightly. "Some are quite exaggerated, I'm sure, but they know you fought in the war, that you're a skilled horseman and marksman. They're fascinated by anyone who's lived through the events they read about in their history books." Beau was about to refuse when he caught the hopeful look in her eyes. "I'll think about it," he said finally. The rain began to let up, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Elizabeth handed back his duster. "Thank you again, Mr. Preston, for everything." As she walked away, Beau found himself watching her go, feeling something stir within him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. That night, for the first time since it had appeared on his porch, Beau picked up the hymnal and began to read. 2 days later, against his better judgment, Beau found himself standing before 20 eager faces in the Kingston schoolhouse, his hat in his hands, feeling more nervous than he had facing armed men. "Children, this is Mr. Preston," Elizabeth announced, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his collar feel too tight. "He's going to tell us about his experiences during the war and the early days of Wyoming territory." Beau cleared his throat. I'm not much for public speaking, but I'll do my best to answer your questions. A forest of small hands shot into the air. Beau pointed to a freckle-faced boy in the front row. "Is it true you killed 20 men in a gunfight in Cheyenne?" the boy asked eagerly. Beau shot Elizabeth an accusing look, which she returned with a helpless shrug and an apologetic smile. "No, that's not true," Beau said firmly. "I've never been in a gunfight where I had to kill anyone, and I hope I never will be. A gun is a tool, like an axe or a plow, but it's a dangerous one. It should only be used as a last resort." The children looked disappointed by this answer, but Beau continued, determined to dispel their romantic notions of violence. Instead, he told them about the real West, the backbreaking work of building a ranch, the beauty of the land in all seasons, the communities that formed despite differences as people relied on one another to survive. When asked about the war, he spoke not of glory, but of young men far from home, of courage shown in small kindnesses rather than battlefield heroics. He found himself opening up more than he had in years, encouraged by Elizabeth's approving nods and the genuine interest of the children. After an hour that passed surprisingly quickly, Elizabeth thanked him and dismissed the class. As the children filed out, many of them thanking him or asking one last question, Beau felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "You were wonderful," Elizabeth said when they were alone. "Thank you for being honest with them. They need to hear the truth about history, not just the sensational stories." "They're good kids," Beau replied, surprised to find he meant it. "You're doing important work here." Elizabeth smiled, a hint of color in her cheeks. "Would you care to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening? As a thank you for today." Beau knew he should refuse. Getting involved with Elizabeth Taylor meant opening doors he'd kept firmly shut for years. And yet, "I'd be honored," he heard himself say. That evening, Beau arrived at the Kingston Hotel wearing his best shirt and waistcoat, his usually unruly hair slicked back, and his boots polished to a shine. Several patrons did double takes as he entered, unused to seeing the solitary rancher dressed for a social occasion. Elizabeth was waiting in the small hotel restaurant, a vision in a simple but elegant green dress that complemented her fair complexion. When she smiled at him, Beau felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with his uncomfortable formal clothes. "You look different," she observed as he took his seat across from her. "Distinguished." "Clean, you mean," Beau said with a self-deprecating smile. "It happens occasionally." Dinner was a revelation. Elizabeth was not only beautiful, but intelligent and witty, with strong opinions on everything from literature to politics. She had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a professor, and had been teaching since she was 18. "After my family died, there was nothing keeping me in Boston," she explained as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Wyoming territory, and something about it called to me. A new beginning in a new place." "That takes courage," Beau said admiringly. "Most Eastern ladies wouldn't dream of coming west alone." Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps I'm not most Eastern ladies." "No," Beau agreed, holding her gaze. "You certainly are not." As they walked back to her boarding house in the soft summer twilight, Beau found himself telling Elizabeth things he'd never shared with anyone about his childhood in Missouri, about the horrors of the war, about the years of drifting before he found his place in Wyoming. "I used to believe in God," he admitted as they reached the white picket fence surrounding Mrs. Jenkins's boarding house. "Believed he had a plan for everyone, but after seeing what men do to each other in his name, after losing everything, it was easier to stop believing." Elizabeth listened without judgment. In the silver moonlight, her face was luminous. "Faith isn't always easy," she said softly. "Sometimes it's hardest when we need it most." She hesitated, then added, "Would you consider coming to church with me on Sunday? Just once?" Beau stiffened, the old resistance rising in him. "I don't think I'm ready for that, Elizabeth." She nodded, accepting his answer without pushing. "I understand. Good night, Beau." Before he could think better of it, Beau reached for her hand and brought it gently to his lips. "Good night, Elizabeth." The touch of her skin against his mouth lingered long after he'd ridden home, a sensation both thrilling and terrifying in its promise. The following days brought a subtle shift in the rhythm of Beau's life. He found himself looking forward to riding into town, to the brief encounters with Elizabeth as she taught her students or ran errands. They began meeting regularly for coffee at the hotel, for walks along the creek that ran behind the town, once for a community picnic where their obvious attachment raised eyebrows and sparked whispers. Beau was aware of the gossip, the notorious Beau Preston courting the respectable schoolteacher. He knew some thought he wasn't good enough for her, that his past made him unsuitable. Part of him agreed with them. "You deserve better than a broken-down cowboy with more scars than prospects," he told her one evening as they sat on a blanket beside the creek, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Elizabeth turned to him, her expression serious. "Don't you think I should be the judge of what I deserve?" She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing a scar along his jawline. "Your scars tell me you've survived, Beau, that you're stronger than whatever tried to break you." When she kissed him, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, Beau felt something inside him begin to heal a wound so old he'd forgotten it was there. Yet for all the joy Elizabeth brought into his life, Beau still couldn't bring himself to accompany her to church. Each Sunday, he would ride her to the white-steepled building in his wagon, tip his hat as she descended, and then find some excuse to be elsewhere during the service, returning only when the congregation emerged, singing their final hymns. "You know," Elizabeth remarked one such Sunday as they rode back to her boarding house, "for someone who never attends church, you're remarkably punctual about arriving just as service ends." Beau chuckled. "Maybe I just like the music." "Then you might enjoy the service itself," she suggested lightly. "Reverend Collins is organizing a special musical program for next Sunday. Many of my students will be singing." Before Beau could formulate his usual polite refusal, a commotion ahead caught their attention. A group of men had gathered outside the saloon, their voices raised in anger. As Beau drew the wagon closer, he recognized Frank Donovan, a local cattle baron known for his quick temper and ruthless business practices. "What's happening?" Elizabeth asked, concern evident in her voice. "Stay here," Beau instructed, setting the brake on the wagon and jumping down. He approached the group cautiously, noting the way Donovan was jabbing his finger into the chest of a younger man Beau recognized as Jeremy Walsh, one of the smaller ranchers from the North Valley. "You stole my water rights and everyone knows it," Walsh was saying, his face flushed with anger. "The creek runs through my property before it reaches yours." "Your property?" Donovan sneered. "That land belonged to my family before yours ever set foot in Wyoming, and I've got the papers to prove it now." Beau stepped closer, sensing the situation was about to escalate. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "this is hardly the place to resolve property disputes. Why not take this to the mayor's office tomorrow?" Donovan turned his glare on Beau. "Stay out of this, Preston. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when men are about to start shooting each other on the main street," Beau replied evenly, "especially when there are women and children present after church." Walsh seemed to deflate slightly at the reminder of their audience, but Donovan was not so easily dissuaded. "You've gone soft, Preston," he sneered. "Time was you wouldn't hesitate to settle a dispute with your gun. Now look at you playing nursemaid to a bunch of churchgoers and courting that Eastern school marm." Beau's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver, but he caught himself, aware of Elizabeth watching from the wagon. "Maybe I've learned there are better ways to resolve differences," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And maybe you should learn the same before you find yourself on the wrong end of someone else's gun." For a tense moment, Beau thought Donovan might draw on him. Instead, the cattle baron spat on the ground near Beau's boots. "This isn't over," he growled before turning to Walsh. "And you be ready to move your herd by the end of the week. That land is mine now." As Donovan and his men mounted their horses and rode out of town, Walsh turned to Beau with a worried expression. "He's filed paperwork claiming rights to the North Creek. If the territorial judge sides with him, I'll lose my water access. My cattle will die. Beau clapped a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We'll figure something out. Come by my ranch tomorrow and we'll talk." When he returned to the wagon, Elizabeth was watching him with an expression that mingled concern and admiration. "That was brave," she said. "Standing up to Frank Donovan isn't something many men would do." Beau helped her back into the wagon, his mind already turning over the implications of what he'd just heard. Donovan had been systematically buying up or legally maneuvering to control most of the water sources in the county. If he succeeded, smaller ranchers like Walsh and possibly even Beau himself would be at his mercy. "It wasn't bravery," Beau replied as he set the wagon in motion again. "Just common sense. Donovan's a bully, and bullies don't stop unless someone stands up to them." Elizabeth studied his profile. "You're a good man, Beau Preston, whether you admit it or not." Beau gave her a sidelong glance. "Don't let that get around town. It'll ruin my reputation." She laughed, the sound lifting his spirits despite his concerns about Donovan. "Your secret is safe with me." The next morning, Beau rode into town early to speak with Mayor Thompson about the water rights situation. To his frustration, he discovered that Donovan's claim appeared legally sound. He had purchased an old Spanish land grant that predated most of the current property deeds in the area. "Nothing I can do about it, Beau," the mayor said apologetically. "It's up to the territorial judge now, and he won't be through Kingston for another month." Beau left the mayor's office deep in thought, so distracted that he nearly collided with Elizabeth outside the general store. "Beau!" she exclaimed, steadying herself with a hand on his arm. "You look troubled. Is it about yesterday's confrontation?" Briefly, Beau explained the situation with the water rights. If Donovan gets control of that creek, half the small ranchers in the county will be ruined, including Walsh. Maybe me too, eventually. Elizabeth's brow furrowed in concern. There must be something that can be done. Short of finding some legal document that supersedes Donovan's claim, I don't see what. A thoughtful expression crossed Elizabeth's face. The Historical Society in Cheyenne might have records that could help. Old land grants, treaties with the native tribes, government surveys from before the territory was established. Beau looked at her with newfound respect. "That's actually a good idea, but Cheyenne is 3 days' ride from here." "I could go," Elizabeth offered. "School term is finished for the summer, and I've been meaning to visit Cheyenne anyway to order new books." "It could be dangerous," Beau protested. "The road to Cheyenne isn't always safe." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps I need an escort, someone skilled with a gun and familiar with the territory." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Beau found himself smiling. "Are you proposing we travel together, Miss Taylor? Think of the scandal." "I'm proposing we help our community." "Mr. Preston," she replied primly, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "The scandal is merely incidental." 2 days later, after hasty preparations and arrangements for his ranch to be watched in his absence, Beau and Elizabeth set out for Cheyenne in a rented buggy. They were accompanied by Mrs. Jenkins, Elizabeth's landlady, who had volunteered to serve as chaperone to preserve Elizabeth's reputation. The journey was arduous, but not unpleasant. The summer weather held fair, and the rolling landscape of eastern Wyoming was at its most beautiful, with vast expanses of prairie grass rippling like a green-gold sea in the breeze. At night, they camped under stars so bright and numerous that Elizabeth, accustomed to city skies, was rendered speechless by their splendor. "It's like looking into eternity," she whispered as they sat by the campfire on their second night, Mrs. Jenkins already asleep in the tent they had pitched for the women. Beau, watching the starlight reflect in Elizabeth's eyes, found himself more captivated by her than by the heavens above. "It does make a man feel small," he agreed. "In a good way." Elizabeth turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Is that why you stopped believing? Because the world is so vast and often cruel?" The question might have angered him once, but now Beau found himself considering it seriously. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly it was seeing men use God to justify their worst actions, slaveholders quoting scripture to defend owning other human beings. both sides of the war claiming divine favor as they slaughtered each other. He stared into the dancing flames. And then there was Shiloh. I was 19. We fought for 2 days in the rain and mud, men dying everywhere, drowning in flooded creeks, bleeding out in orchards full of white blossoms. I kept praying, but the killing just went on and on. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted by memories. Where was God then, Elizabeth? Where was he when good men on both sides died in agony? Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, her hand finding his in the darkness. I don't know, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. I don't pretend to understand why terrible things happen, but I believe God weeps with us when we suffer, that he feels our pain as his own. Beau wanted to scoff, to dismiss her words as naive comfort, but something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't offering pat answers or easy platitudes. She was sharing her own hard-won faith, tested by her own losses. The hymn you left me, he said suddenly. I've been reading it, thinking about it. I once was lost, but now am found. What does that mean to you? Elizabeth's smile was gentle in the firelight. To me, it means that no matter how far we wander, how lost we feel, we're never beyond being found again, being loved again. Her fingers tightened around his. By God, yes, but also by other people, by community, by... She hesitated, then finished softly. By those who care for us. Beau brought her hand to his lips, his heart full of emotions he couldn't yet name. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For not giving up on me. They arrived in Cheyenne the following afternoon, a dusty, trail-worn trio, eager for proper beds and hot baths. After securing rooms at the Cheyenne Hotel, Beau went to stable their horses while Elizabeth and Mrs. Jenkins refreshed themselves. The territorial capital was a bustling place compared to Kingston, with brick buildings, boardwalks, and the constant activity of a growing commercial center. Beau, who visited only when necessary for business, felt out of place amid the mix of government officials, businessmen, and fashionable ladies who populated the main streets. The next morning, while Mrs. Jenkins visited an old friend, Beau and Elizabeth made their way to the Wyoming Historical Society, housed in a stately brick building near the territorial government offices. The society's archivist, a bespectacled man named Harold Finch, was initially reluctant to allow them access to the oldest records until Elizabeth charmed him with her genuine interest in territorial history and her credentials as an educator. We're specifically looking for land grants and water rights documentation for the Kingston area, Elizabeth explained, particularly anything that might predate or supersede a Spanish land grant from 1792 that encompasses the North Creek region. For hours, they pored over dusty ledgers, maps, and legal documents, their excitement fading as the search proved more difficult than anticipated. By late afternoon, Beau's eyes were burning from the strain of reading faded script, and even Elizabeth's enthusiasm had dimmed. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow, she suggested, rubbing her temples. We still have another day before we need to start back. Beau nodded, closing yet another fruitless volume. As he stood to stretch his cramped muscles, his attention was caught by a framed map on the wall, an early survey of the Wyoming Territory conducted by the U.S. Army in 1868. Elizabeth, he called softly, moving closer to the map. Look at this. She joined him, following his pointing finger to a notation near the Kingston area. Indian Reservation Boundary. Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, she read aloud. Beau, the North Creek is within the boundary. Excitement surging, they called Mr. Finch over and explained what they'd found. The archivist adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Ah, yes. The Second Treaty of Fort Laramie established several reservation boundaries, though many were subsequently revised or nullified by later agreements. He tapped the map. However, certain water rights were specifically protected even after boundary changes. Let me see if we have the complete treaty documentation. An hour later, they had their answer. The North Creek had indeed been designated as communal water access in the treaty, with explicit language ensuring that all settlers and inhabitants shall have equal right to utilization of said waterways for irrigation and livestock. This supersedes any private land grant, Mr. Finch confirmed, even one predating the treaty. The federal government's agreement with the tribes established a new legal framework for the territory. Elizabeth squeezed Beau's hand, her face alight with triumph. We did it. The next morning, armed with certified copies of the relevant treaty sections and an official letter from the Wyoming Historical Society, they began the journey back to Kingston, their spirits high despite the prospect of another long trip. I can't wait to see Donovan's face when you present these documents, Elizabeth said as their buggy rolled through the open countryside. He's been bullying smaller ranchers for years. He won't take it well, Beau cautioned. Men like Donovan aren't used to losing. We should be prepared for trouble. His prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. On the second day of their return journey, as they made camp for the evening, Beau spotted dust on the horizon, riders approaching fast from the direction of Cheyenne. Get inside the tent, he instructed Elizabeth and Mrs. Jenkins, his hand moving to his revolver. And stay there until I call you. Beau, Elizabeth began, her voice tight with worry. Please, Elizabeth, just do as I ask. Reluctantly, she and Mrs. Jenkins retreated to the tent while Beau positioned himself near the campfire, outwardly relaxed but inwardly alert, his revolver within easy reach. As the riders drew closer, Beau recognized Donovan's foreman, Silas Madden, accompanied by two men he didn't know, hard-faced individuals with the unmistakable look of hired guns. Preston, Madden called as they reined to a stop at the edge of the camp. Thought that was you. Interesting coincidence finding you on the road from Cheyenne. Not really a coincidence if you've been following us, Beau replied evenly. What can I do for you, Madden? The foreman dismounted, his spurs jingling in the growing dusk. Mr. Donovan heard you've been poking around in Cheyenne, looking into matters that don't concern you. Water rights concern every rancher in the county. Madden's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Donovan's willing to be reasonable. He sent me to make you an offer, $500 for you to stop interfering and head back to your ranch, a generous amount for a small spread like yours. Beau felt a cold anger building inside him, but he kept his voice level. And if I decline his generous offer? Then things might get unpleasant, Madden replied, his hand resting casually near his own pistol, for you and your traveling companions. The implied threat to Elizabeth made Beau's blood run cold. You tell Donovan I'm not for sale, he said, his voice hardening, and neither is the law. The treaty rights we found in Cheyenne supersede his claim to the North Creek. Every rancher will have equal access, just as before. Madden's expression darkened. You're making a mistake, Preston. Wouldn't be my first, Beau replied. Now, unless you and your friends plan to make camp with us, I suggest you ride on. It'll be dark soon. For a tense moment, Beau thought Madden might escalate the confrontation. Instead, the foreman spat into the fire. This isn't over. Mr. Donovan doesn't take kindly to interference. Neither do I, Beau said quietly. Remember that. After the riders departed, Elizabeth emerged from the tent, her face pale but determined. You think they'll be back? It wasn't a question, but Beau nodded anyway. Not tonight, but once we reach Kingston, Donovan won't take this lying down. We need to be careful. Elizabeth moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. We're doing the right thing, Beau. For everyone in Kingston. I know, he said, his arm slipping around her waist. But doing right doesn't always mean things turn out right. I've learned that the hard way. Then we'll face whatever comes together, she said firmly. All of Kingston will. The remainder of their journey passed without incident, though Beau remained vigilant, often riding ahead to scout the trail or falling behind to ensure they weren't followed. When they finally crested the last hill overlooking Kingston, the sight of the familiar buildings nestled in the valley brought an unexpected lump to his throat. Home, Elizabeth murmured beside him, echoing his thoughts. Word of their return and their discovery spread quickly through town. By nightfall, Mayor Thompson had called an emergency meeting at the town hall, where Beau and Elizabeth presented the treaty documents to a packed room of ranchers, merchants, and townspeople. According to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, Elizabeth explained, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hall, the North Creek is designated as communal water access. No private claim, regardless of age or origin, can supersede this federal agreement. "What does this mean for Donovan's claim?" called out Jeremy Walsh from the back of the room. Mayor Thompson adjusted his spectacles as he examined the documents. "It means his exclusive claim to the water rights is invalid. The creek must remain accessible to all property owners whose land it traverses or borders." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but Beau noticed not everyone looked pleased. Several of Donovan's associates were present, their expressions darkening as the implications became clear. "This isn't settled yet," warned one of them, a banker named Harrison who had financed many of Donovan's land acquisitions. "The territorial judge will have the final say." "And he'll have these documents to consider when he does," Elizabeth replied firmly. "The treaty is federal law. Not even a territorial judge can simply ignore it." After the meeting, as people dispersed into the warm summer night, Beau escorted Elizabeth back to her boarding house, both of them aware of the heightened tension in town. "You should stay with friends for a few days," Beau suggested as they reached the picket fence. "Donovan won't be happy about this, and I don't trust him to play by the rules." Elizabeth shook her head. "I won't hide, Beau. That would send the wrong message to everyone in Kingston who's counting on us to stand firm." Beau recognized the determination in her eyes, the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "At least let me check in on you regularly," he conceded, "and keep your doors locked at night." She smiled up at him, her face silvered by moonlight. "I will. And Beau, thank you for everything." On impulse, he pulled her close and kissed her, not caring who might see them. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Elizabeth touched his face gently. "Will you come to church on Sunday?" she asked. "The children's musical program. It would mean a lot to them, and to me." Beau hesitated, the old resistance rising automatically. But as he looked into her hopeful eyes, he found it harder to cling to his bitterness. "I'll think about it," he said finally. The next few days passed in a state of uneasy anticipation. Beau divided his time between his ranch and town, where he kept a protective eye on Elizabeth while helping organize the ranchers to present a united front against Donovan's claim. Frank Donovan himself remained conspicuously absent from Kingston, though rumors circulated that he had ridden to the territorial capital to present his case directly to influential officials there. On Saturday evening, Beau was repairing a fence on his property when he heard approaching hoofbeats. Reaching for the rifle he kept nearby, he watched tensely as a rider emerged from the tree line. To his surprise, it was Reverend Collins, the young minister of Kingston's church. Beau had spoken with him only a few times since the Reverend's arrival in town a year earlier. "Mr. Preston," the minister called, raising a hand in greeting as he rode closer. "I hope I'm not intruding." Beau set aside his rifle, nodding in acknowledgement. "Reverend, this is unexpected." Collins dismounted, a slender man in his early 30s with kind eyes and an earnest manner. "I wanted to personally invite you to tomorrow's service. The children have worked very hard on their musical program, and Miss Taylor mentioned you might attend." "Did she send you here?" Beau asked, unable to keep a note of suspicion from his voice. The Reverend shook his head. "No, this was my idea. And not just because of the music." He hesitated, then continued. "What you and Miss Taylor did in Cheyenne finding those treaty documents, it was a true service to this community. It reminded me of something Jesus said about the Good Shepherd being willing to lay down his life for his sheep." Beau turned back to his fence work, uncomfortable with the comparison. "I'm no shepherd, Reverend, and certainly no saint." "None of us are," Collins replied simply. "That's rather the point of faith, isn't it? That we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love." The words echoed Elizabeth's explanation of grace, striking a chord deep within Beau. He hammered a nail with more force than necessary, saying nothing. After a moment, the Reverend continued. Did you know the church building was a community effort? Even those who never attend services helped build it, because they understood that a town needs more than just places to work and drink and sleep. It needs a place where people can come together to remember they're part of something larger than themselves. And what's that? Beau asked, genuinely curious despite his resistance. A story, Colin said, one that's been unfolding since the beginning of time, about fallenness and redemption, about how no one is beyond the reach of grace. He smiled gently. Even a cowboy who stopped believing. Before Beau could respond, the Reverend mounted his horse again. Service starts at 10 tomorrow. The door is always open, Mr. Preston. With a tip of his hat, he rode away, leaving Beau to his thoughts. That night, Beau took the hymnal from his shelf and read through it cover to cover, the words no longer seeming like hollow promises, but rather like a conversation, one that had been going on for centuries, through war and peace, joy and suffering. When he finally slept, his dreams were not of battlefields, but of Elizabeth's smile, of children singing, of a community standing together against threats both from within and without. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that made the hardships of Wyoming winters seem like distant memories. Beau woke early, completed his ranch chores, and then after a long moment of the internal debate, put on his best suit, the one he'd worn only twice before, once for his father's funeral and once for dinner with Elizabeth. As he rode toward town, he felt strangely nervous, like a boy approaching his first dance. The familiar white steeple of Kingston's church seemed both welcoming and intimidating as it came into view. Beau tethered Thunder to the hitching post, noticing with some surprise how many horses and wagons were already gathered. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the children's program. He hesitated at the bottom of the steps, one hand touching the hymnal in his pocket for reassurance. Then, taking a deep breath, he climbed the stairs and entered the church for the first time. The interior was simple but beautiful, with polished wooden pews, colorful stained glass windows, and sunlight streaming in to illuminate the space with jewel-toned patterns. Near the front, Elizabeth sat with her students, helping them arrange their sheet music. When she glanced up and saw Beau standing in the doorway, her face transformed with joy. Several heads turned to follow her gaze, and a ripple of surprised murmurs swept through the congregation as people recognized the newcomer in their midst. Beau felt his face grow warm under the scrutiny, but then Jeremy Walsh, seated with his family, moved over to make room in their pew, gesturing for Beau to join them. "Glad you could make it, Preston," Walsh said quietly as Beau sat beside him, "especially after all you've done this week." Before Beau could reply, Reverend Collins stepped to the pulpit, his face lighting up when he spotted Beau in the congregation. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice warm and welcoming. "Today is a special day for our community. Not only will we be blessed by the musical talents of our children, but we are also joined by friends both old and new." The service began with familiar hymns that stirred memories from Beau's childhood, his mother's clear soprano leading him and his sisters in song around their humble Missouri hearth. To his surprise, he found himself joining in, the words coming back to him as if the years of silence had never been. When it was time for the children's performance, Elizabeth led them to the front of the church, where they arranged themselves in neat rows. Among them was Annie Walsh, Jeremy's 10-year-old daughter, who had been one of the most curious questioners during Beau's visit to the schoolhouse. As the children began to sing Amazing Grace, the very hymn Elizabeth had marked in the book she left on his porch, Beau felt an unexpected emotion welling up inside him. The pure, clear voices of the children filled the church, singing of being lost and found, blind, but now seeing with a simplicity that cut through years of cynicism and doubt. Beau was so moved by the performance that he almost didn't notice the commotion at the back of the church until several people gasped. Turning in his seat, he saw Frank Donovan standing in the doorway, flanked by Madden and several other men. Donovan's face was flushed with anger, or drink, possibly both. "Don't stop on my account," he called out sarcastically as the singing faltered. "I just came to see the town that thinks it can stand against me." Reverend Collins moved quickly to intercept the intruders. "Mr. Donovan, you're welcome to join our service, but I must ask you to show respect for our house of worship." "Respect?" Donovan sneered. "Like the respect shown to me when Preston and that schoolteacher undermined my legal claim?" His gaze found Beau in the congregation. "You think those treaty papers will save you? I've got friends in the territorial government who know how to make inconvenient documents disappear." Beau stood slowly, aware of Elizabeth gathering the children protectively behind her. "This isn't the place for this discussion, Donovan. If you want to talk, we can do it outside." "Oh, we're well past talking," Donovan replied, his hand moving toward his coat. "I came to send a message about what happens to people who cross me." Several things happened at once. Madden and the other men spread out, blocking the exit. Women pulled children close, and men began to rise from their pews. And Elizabeth, seeing Donovan's hand disappear into his coat, stepped forward. "Mr. Donovan," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the danger, "whatever grievance you have is with me and Mr. Preston, not with these children or the good people of Kingston. If you've come to threaten us, at least have the decency to do so away from those who have no part in this dispute." Her courage seemed to give others strength. One by one, men and women stood, moving to form a protective barrier between Donovan's group and the children. "You're outnumbered, Frank," Mayor Thompson said, his normally mild voice firm. "And the law isn't on your side this time. Those treaty rights are valid, and they protect all of us, even you, should you ever need water access yourself." Donovan's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this. All of you." His hand emerged from his coat empty. With a final glare at Beau, he backed toward the door. "This isn't over, Preston." "Yes, it is," Beau replied quietly. "You just don't know it yet." After Donovan and his men departed, the congregation remained tense, whispering among themselves. Reverend Collins raised his hands for silence. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "we have witnessed something important today. Not the threats of angry men, those are as old as time, but the strength of a community standing together." He smiled, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townspeople. "In the face of intimidation, you chose courage. In the face of division, you chose unity. These are the values our faith calls us to embody." As the Reverend continued with a prayer for peace and protection, Beau made his way to Elizabeth's side. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, taking her trembling hand in his. She nodded, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "I'm fine, but the children are frightened." Together, they helped settle the young ones, speaking reassuring words and organizing parents to escort them home in groups. By the time the church had emptied, only Beau, Elizabeth, Reverend Collins, and a few town leaders remained. "Donovan won't give up easily," Walsh warned. "He's got too much pride and too much money invested in controlling that water." "We need to be prepared," agreed Thompson. "I'll send for the territorial marshal, but it could be days before he arrives." Beau, who had been silent during the discussion, finally spoke. "In the meantime, we organize watches. 2 men at the North Creek crossing at all times, armed, but under strict orders not to provoke anything." The others nodded their agreement, and soon a rotation was established, with Beau taking the first watch that very afternoon. As the meeting broke up, Elizabeth pulled him aside. "Be careful," she said, her eyes searching his face. "Donovan is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Beau touched her cheek gently. "I will. And Elizabeth, thank you for coming into my life, for leaving that hymn on my porch." His voice roughened with emotion. "You've reminded me what it means to have something worth fighting for, worth believing in." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And you've shown me that faith isn't just about words in a book or songs in a church. It's about actions, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Before they parted, Beau kissed her once, briefly but tenderly. "I'll see you tonight," he promised. For 3 days, Kingston existed in a state of tense vigilance. The watches at the creek continued without incident, and some began to hope that Donovan had decided to pursue his claim through legal channels after all. On the 4th night, Beau was at his ranch, having completed his watch shift earlier that day. He was about to turn in when a rider approached at a gallop Jeremy Walsh, his face streaked with soot and his clothes singed. "Beau," he called, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Donovan's men, they've set fire to the schoolhouse, and they've taken Elizabeth." Cold fear gripped Beau's heart. When? How many men? Less than an hour ago, 5 or 6 of them. They came into town shooting, set the schoolhouse ablaze to create confusion, then grabbed Elizabeth from the boarding house. Walsh's voice broke. "They said they're holding her until you come alone to Donovan's ranch." Beau was already moving, checking his revolver and gathering ammunition. "Ride back to town. Get as many armed men as you can. Follow me to Donovan's place, but stay out of sight unless you hear shooting." "Beau," Walsh said hesitantly, "there are too many of them. You can't go alone." "I have to," Beau replied, his voice hard as steel. "He's expecting me to come alone, and I won't risk Elizabeth's life by doing anything different." He mounted Thunder, the big stallion sensing his urgency. "But having reinforcements nearby won't hurt. Just make sure they understand no one moves unless I signal, or things go bad." As he rode through the darkness toward Donovan's ranch, Beau felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a certainty he hadn't felt in years. Whatever happened tonight, he would not let Elizabeth down. He would not let Kingston down. And for the first time since the war, Beau Preston prayed not the desperate bargaining of a frightened boy on a battlefield, but the steady, determined petition of a man who had found something to believe in again. "Not for my sake," he whispered into the wind. "For hers. For all of them." Donovan's ranch house was ablaze with light when Beau approached, making no attempt to conceal his arrival. He rode directly to the front of the sprawling 2-story building and dismounted, leaving his rifle in its scabbard but keeping his revolver holstered at his side. "Donovan," he called out, "I'm here, just like you wanted. Show me that Elizabeth is safe." The front door opened, and Frank Donovan emerged, a satisfied smile on his face. "Preston, right on time." He gestured, and 2 of his men appeared, holding Elizabeth between them. She was disheveled but appeared unharmed, her eyes widening when she saw Beau. "Let her go," Beau said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." Donovan descended the steps, stopping a few yards from Beau. "My quarrel is with anyone who interferes with my business. The schoolteacher has been particularly troublesome in that regard." "The treaty rights are legally binding," Elizabeth said, struggling against her captors. "Even if you hurt us, it won't change that." Donovan laughed, a harsh sound in the night air. "Maybe not. But it will send a message to anyone else thinking of standing against me." He turned back to Beau. "I'm going to give you a choice, Preston. You can sign over your ranch to me, water rights and all, and ride out of Wyoming territory forever. If you do, the schoolteacher goes free. Or you can refuse, in which case neither of you leaves here alive." "Don't do it, Beau," Elizabeth called, earning her a rough shake from one of her captors. Beau met Donovan's gaze unflinchingly. "I've got a different proposal. You let Elizabeth go, turn yourself in to the territorial marshal for kidnapping and arson, and maybe you'll only spend 10 years in prison instead of hanging." Donovan's smile vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You're in no position to make demands." "Aren't I?" Beau replied calmly. "You think I came here without a plan? Right now, 20 armed men from Kingston are surrounding this place, just waiting for my signal." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Donovan's face, and he glanced toward the darkness beyond the pool of light from the house. "You're bluffing." "Maybe," Beau acknowledged, "but are you willing to bet your life on it?" He took a step forward. "You've lived in Wyoming long enough to know how this territory deals with men who take the law into their own hands. How do you think a jury will react when they hear you kidnapped a schoolteacher and threatened to kill her? For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Donovan reached for his gun. "Don't," Beau warned, his own hand hovering near his holster. "There's a better way to end this." But pride and rage had overcome Donovan's reason. With a snarl, he drew his pistol only to find himself staring down the barrel of Beau's revolver, which had appeared in the gunslinger's hand with lightning speed. "Last chance," Beau said quietly. In answer, Donovan fired and missed, his shot going wide as panic destroyed his aim. Beau's return shot was deliberate and precise, striking Donovan in the shoulder of his gun arm. The cattle baron went down with a cry of pain, his weapon falling to the dirt. Chaos erupted as Donovan's men reached for their guns. Elizabeth took advantage of the confusion to drive her elbow into the stomach of one captor and twist away from the other. Beau fired again, winging a man who was aiming at Elizabeth, then dove to pull her behind the cover of a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around them. "Are there really 20 men out there?" Elizabeth gasped, pressing close to him in the darkness. "More like 6 or 7, Beau admitted, "but they should be moving in right about." Gunfire erupted from the perimeter of the ranch as Walsh and the others from Kingston began shooting, careful to aim high to avoid hitting Beau and Elizabeth. The distraction was enough. Donovan's outnumbered men, believing themselves surrounded, quickly lost their appetite for the fight. "Hold your fire," called Madden, who had taken charge after Donovan's injury. "We're coming out. Don't shoot." One by one, they emerged from the house and the barn, hands raised in surrender. Last came Donovan himself, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of hatred as he glared at Beau. "You've ruined me," he spat. "No," Beau replied, keeping his arm protectively around Elizabeth as they stood to face him. "You did that yourself when you decided your greed was more important than the law, than people's lives." As Walsh and the others secured Donovan and his men, Elizabeth turned to Beau, her face pale but resolute in the lamplight spilling from the house. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. "Always," he promised, pulling her close. The next few weeks brought significant changes to Kingston. Frank Donovan was taken into custody by the territorial marshal and transported to Cheyenne to stand trial for kidnapping, arson, and attempted murder. Most of his property was sold to pay his legal fees and compensate those he had wronged, with the North Creek access legally guaranteed for all adjoining ranchers. The schoolhouse was rebuilt in record time, with virtually every able-bodied person in town contributing labor or materials. It reopened just in time for the fall term, larger and sturdier than before. Beau, to the surprise of many, became a regular attendee at church services, sitting in the same pew each Sunday with Elizabeth beside him. And if some still found it strange to see the former gunslinger singing hymns, they kept their comments to themselves, especially after he led the effort to add a new bell to the church tower in Thanksgiving for the town's deliverance from Donovan's threats. On a crisp October day, with the aspens turning gold on the surrounding hillsides, Beau Preston stood before Reverend Collins in that same church, watching as Elizabeth walked down the aisle toward him in a simple white dress, her face radiant with happiness. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began as Elizabeth took her place beside Beau, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two people whose journey toward each other has been one of faith rediscovered and courage revealed." The church was packed with well-wishers, the children from Elizabeth's school, the ranchers and townspeople who had stood with them against Donovan, and even a few surprise guests, including the territorial governor, who had been so impressed by their discovery of the treaty rights that he had appointed Beau to a commission on water access. As they exchanged vows, Beau thought of the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment from the battlefields of Tennessee to the wild frontier of Wyoming, from a solitary existence to the heart of a community, from bitter disbelief to the quiet certainty that some things were indeed worth believing in. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins declared to the joyful applause of the congregation. "You may kiss the bride." As Beau drew Elizabeth into their first kiss as husband and wife, he felt something settle inside him, a peace he had not known since childhood. Outside the church, as they emerged into the golden autumn sunlight amid a shower of flower petals and cheers, Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "Happy?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "More than I ever thought possible," Beau replied honestly. "You left a hymn on my porch and changed everything." "Amazing grace," she quoted softly, smiling up at him. "Indeed it is," he agreed, kissing her once more before they descended the steps to begin their life together. A life built on love, faith, and the strength of a community that had learned to stand together against whatever challenges the frontier might bring. 5 years later, on another perfect autumn day, Beau Preston sat on the porch of his expanded ranch house, watching his 3-year-old son Benjamin playing with wooden horses while baby Sarah napped in her mother's arms. "Papa, tell the story," Benjamin demanded, abandoning his toys to climb onto Beau's knee. "About the hymn and the bad man, and how you saved Mama." Beau chuckled, ruffling the boy's dark hair so like his own. "Again? You've heard it 100 times." "It's his favorite," Elizabeth said, smiling over their daughter's sleeping form. "Mine too, if I'm being honest." "Very well," Beau conceded, settling Benjamin more comfortably on his lap. "Once upon a time, there was a cowboy who never went to church." As he recounted their story, carefully edited for young ears, Beau gazed out over his land, now prospering with the shared water access that had been secured for all of Kingston's ranchers. In the distance, he could see the white steeple of the church where he now served as a deacon, helping Reverend Collins minister to the growing congregation. Life wasn't perfect. Wyoming winters were still harsh, raising cattle was still backbreaking work, and the frontier still presented daily challenges. But Beau faced each day with something he had once thought lost forever: hope. Hope and faith, not just in God, but in people, in community, in the power of standing together against adversity. "And that's why we always keep that special hymnal on our shelf," he concluded, pointing to the worn leather book that held a place of honor in their home. "Because it reminds us that no one is ever too lost to be found again." Benjamin nodded solemnly, though he'd likely be asking for the story again tomorrow. "I'm glad you found Mama, Papa." "So am I, son," Beau said, looking at his wife with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "So am I." As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, just as it had on the day he'd found the hymnal on his porch, Beau Preston said a silent prayer of gratitude for the woman who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, for the children who carried their shared legacy forward, and for a small frontier town that had become not just a place to live, but a true home. Amazing grace indeed.